Well, we're just a few short days away from LSU taking the field in the Citrus Bowl against Purdue on January 2nd. So let's get to know the team that will be fielding in the Citrus Bowl and one position group that makes me a little bit more concerned than others. All of that plus so much more on today's edition of Locked on LSU.
You are Locked on LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast. Plus, you can find us on YouTube as well at Locked on LSU. And of course, Locked on LSU, we are part of the Locked on Network, your team every day. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I am your host, as I am every day. I graduated from LSU. I've been covering LSU sports since 2016. I'm now a sports talk radio host in Nashville, Tennessee. You can find me on Twitter at Caroline Fenton1. And of course, you can follow the podcast for updates at Locked on LSU as well. So now we're pretty deep into bowl season. We had a crazy Ole Miss Texas Tech game, a Kansas Arkansas game that was one of the craziest comebacks that I've seen in quite some time. But I think what goes along with the craziness of bowl season and kind of what I think the motivating factor behind that is because in the transfer portal era and in the opt-out era, we don't really know what to expect from these teams in the postseason because their star quarterback may have declared for the NFL draft and has opted out of the bowl game, and therefore you have a completely different team fielded than you saw for the rest of the season. So the team that you got to know isn't necessarily that team that is going to be playing in the bowl game. For example, I'm doing a pre and post game show for the Music City Bowl. Tune in if you're in Nashville. Will Levis is not playing. So it's a completely different Kentucky team that I honestly have no idea what it's going to look like. And I think that's kind of the same thing for LSU, but not necessarily starting quarterback, but on the defensive side of the ball, and more specifically on the defensive line. Because one of the best attributes for this LSU offensive or defensive line rather this past year is that there was a lot of talent and there were a lot of guys that have been there, a lot of guys that had been around, that have experience, and not just college football experience, but experience at LSU. That I looked at the defensive line and I kind of looked at that as like almost an anchor on this team. That the cornerback group, the defensive back group as a whole, was comprised of so many transfer portal players, but it was that defensive line group that we really knew what to expect. So whenever you have that privilege going into one season, you start to lose it going into the next because those players, of course, ultimately go on to do bigger and better things. So getting to know the defensive line that we are going to see in the Citrus Bowl on January 2nd against Purdue. So what we do know for certain on the defensive line, we know that BJ Ojulari is out. He has declared for the NFL draft. Jaquelin Roy, he is also out. Gaye, also out. They are declaring for the NFL draft, and they have announced that they will opt out of the bowl game. Totally fine. Totally get it. So who are going to be the players that fill in BJ Ojulari, Jaquelin Roy, and Gaye's spots? So we know for certain Mekhi Wingo is going to be out there on the defensive line. And transferred in from Missouri this past year, really proved that he's a leader on this team and produces on the field as well. So we know that Mekhi Wingo is going to be probably the focal point of this defensive line against Purdue. 41 total tackles on the season, 2 sacks, 1 forced fumble. That's kind of a known commodity that we proved himself this past year and that we're going to see against Purdue in the Citrus Bowl. But a couple names that are kind of, up in the air. A few names that we haven't seen a ton of. Some of these names we've seen a little bit of. But for a lot of these guys, this is going to be their biggest, best opportunity, or maybe even their first opportunity. And one player that I'm looking at is sophomore Savion Jones, who we saw in 7 games this year. He had sacks against Arkansas, New Mexico, and Mississippi State. He had 3.5 total sacks on the season. So he got some snaps in the 2022 season, but wasn't a consistent start, was never a starter, was never a consistent rotational guy, but did see the field at some point and did see a few snaps. I think you're going to see a whole lot of Savion Jones in 2023, but was one of those guys that really kind of had to work his way up through the depth chart, and now we'll get more of those opportunities now that there are 3 defensive line spots and edge rusher spots opening up in the 2023 season. So Savion Jones is going to be one that I'm at least going to be looking at in the bowl game. And all of this to say, somebody asked me, it was Kendon on Twitter, asked me for a mailbag Wednesday. Are you excited for this game? And I said, I'm excited for this game for a lot of reasons, but one of those biggest reasons is I'm excited to see some of the young guys that we don't get to see a lot from, to see, okay, who's going to be, a splash maker in training camp, who is going to be the next guy, the next man up. And we start to see glimpses of that in bowl games. So Savion Jones is going to be one of those that I think if you don't know his name now, you're going to know it. And that starts against Purdue. And then I think you're also going to see a good bit of Mike Jones Jr. Transfer in from Clemson, who played in all 13 in games this year. He appeared in 13 games this year, including the SEC championship, but just hasn't gotten a ton of snaps. Same thing as Savion Jones. Even though Mike Jones has seen the field more, just because he does have more experience. Of course, sophomore Savion Jones, Mike Jones Jr. has been in college football for 4 years, I believe now. So he played in all 13 games, but still hasn't gotten a ton of snaps. And kind of the same reason. He was just buried on the depth chart. But he had 20 tackles on the season, and half of those were for loss. No sacks on the season. So I think you're going to start to see Mike Jones Jr. Pop off a little bit in the bowl game as well. But there are a lot of guys who have redshirted, and some of these names you might not even know, but whose names have appeared on the bowl season depth chart. One in particular that I'm highlighting, circling, putting a star next to, is true freshman redshirt Quency Wiggins. And I'm starring that because that's a name that Brian Kelly mentioned in his press conference this past weekend. He mentioned how a lot of the guys that were buried in the depth chart or redshirted will get opportunities and have been playing in scrimmages throughout the week, and also will get opportunities in the bowl game. And Quency Wiggins was a name that he mentioned, so looking forward to see some of him. And of course, the rest of the red shirts: freshman Tygee Hill, sophomore Jacobian Guillory, freshman Bryan Langston. I don't know how much you're going to see of them, or if you're going to see them at all. But of course, now with the new rule for the NCAA that playing in a bowl game will not endanger your redshirt status, I think you could see some of those guys rotate in and out, start to get some of those in-game reps. So even though BJ Ojulari, Jaquelin Roy, and Gaye will be out for the bowl game, and defensive line is a position of concern for me for the bowl game, this defensive line group is not going to be as shallow, or is not going to have as few players next season as it does for the bowl game. So coming up next, I want to break down all the work that Brian Kelly and company has done in the transfer portal, specifically at that position. We'll get into that coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about BetOnline.net. BetOnlinenet is your number one source for sports betting information, stats, news, and analysis, so you can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. There's pro football. It's college bowl season. I've mentioned so many times, I just absolutely adore college bowl season. And it's a difficult games. They are difficult games to bet on, but I love doing it anyway. So do it at betonline.net. There's also basketball, both at the college and pro level. They've got it all at betonline.net. So if you love sports podcasts, you can even find those on betonline.net as well. It is truly your one-stop shop. So it's always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting information. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. So make sure to check out Locked On Sports today. They've got the biggest stories around the sports world in 20 minutes or less. Who doesn't love that? Plus instant reactions, game recaps, and Locked On's take of the day. Locked On Sports today, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. So the defensive line for LSU is going to be fairly thin in the bowl game. And so that was one position group that I talked about really ad nauseum over the past couple of weeks. Now that the transfer portal is open and LSU was doing some recruiting both in the transfer portal and at the high school level in 2023, that was one position group, in addition to defensive back, most notably cornerback, in addition to running back, in addition to tight end. The defense was really one position of need. And especially now that BJ Ojulari, Jaquelin Roy, Gaye, they will all be entering the NFL draft. What does the defensive line look like, not just against Purdue, but in 2023 and beyond? Well, Brian Kelly and the entire recruiting staff has been putting in that work overall in the transfer portal in the 2023 class, even more specifically on the defensive side of the ball, and even more specifically than that, on the defensive line. So since we last chatted, just some updates. The official signings of four-star Deshaun Womack, an edge rusher. Four-star Jackson Howard, again, another edge rusher. And also to cap out that trio of edge rushers in the 2023 class, you've got three-star Dylan Carpenter, Louisiana kid out of Santa Monica. So you got three edge rushers coming in the 2023 class. And it's under my understanding, per John Garcia Jr., of course, who we appreciate him joining the podcast, a friend of the podcast. He's a Sports Illustrated recruiting insider. He said Deshaun Womack is going to be one of those kids that can come in as a true freshman and maybe not contribute week one, day one, but he'll be able to contribute year one. So that's one name that I'm looking at in particular. But you got a whole lot of edge rushers there. You know, you need to fill in some of those interior defensive linemen. And that's exactly what this coaching staff found. So since we last chatted, West Virginia transfer defensive lineman Jordan Jefferson, who's played a majority of snaps at defensive tackle and nose tackle, who has started for West Virginia over the past couple of years and had his best season in 2021, had 31 tackles. 9.5 of those tackles were for loss. That is a team best in the 2021 season, and 3 sacks to cap all of that out. He had so that's going to be, with his experience and also his size, he's going to be ready to come in and start right away. And then you add that to the 3 different defensive linemen that committed last week, that transferred into LSU last week. Defensive end Paris Shand, who's a redshirt sophomore this past year, who spent 3 seasons at Arizona. In 2022, he had 23 tackles, 2.5 sacks, 1 forced fumble, kind of filling in that defensive end spot that is left open by Gaye. So we have Paris Shand, a defensive end who has 2 years of experience at Arizona coming in the 2023 season. Also have Jalen Lee, a nose tackle out of Florida, redshirt sophomore, another one. He's from Denham Springs area, so a local kid, played at Live Oak High School. He is coming back to LSU, transferring in from Florida, like I mentioned. He spent 3 years, at Florida, played in 25 games, had 19 tackles, 3 of those for loss and a sack in 2022. He didn't start in 12 games, but played in 12 games, had 8 tackles, no sacks. Not a huge marquee season for Jalen Lee, but I can only imagine that he was buried underneath the depth chart. And just, with turnover at coaching staff, things are always up in the air. So, not a thrilling season from Jalen Lee, but he is a body with experience and will be able to fill in that nose tackle role that has been left open by Jaquelin Roy. And of course, I'm saying that they are filling these holes, but they're going to be competing to fill those holes. These are not starting jobs that are just handed out to guys that are transferring in just because they may have more experience than other guys on the roster. But that fourth and final defensive line transfer that'll be coming into LSU in 2023. And also remember, the transfer portal is open for another 3 weeks. So this is 4 and counting. And this is 4 just on the defensive line alone. LSU bringing in a cornerback transfer, Zay Alexander out of Southeastern, a 3-year starter at Southeastern, 97 tackles, 12 pass breakups, and 9 interceptions in his career at Southeastern. Of course, A&M transfer Denver Harris at the cornerback position. He's a 5-star recruit coming out of high school. It was a huge get for LSU. Adds much needed depth and talent at the cornerback position. So it's not just on the defensive line. Corners are coming in as well. And of course, at every other position. I'm just focusing on the defensive line for now. But that fourth and final defensive lineman is an Oregon edge rusher, Braden Swinson from Georgia. Played his college ball at Oregon for the last 2 years. 35 tackles, 5.5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, had 8 tackles in 2022. And that was really it for his season in 2022. Again, you got so many great pass rushers at Oregon. And also, again, change at head coach, change up in defensive scheme. That's going to kind of throw a hitch in your production. So those 4 transfers coming in the defensive line to add to the 3 pass rushers coming into the 2023 class. So while defensive line is a position of concern right now for me against Purdue, looking long-term, looking ahead a couple years, LSU, a couple months, looking ahead to next year, LSU has found pieces, both true freshmen that can be developed, which is, of course, something that Brian Kelly mentioned that he wants to be a cornerstone of this program, is developing freshmen, bringing freshmen in, and kind of in making the transfer portal secondary, but also using the transfer portal to build in positions when needed so you can compete while also developing young players as well. So the defensive line, a little bit concerned, but also excited to see some of the young guys against Purdue and excited to see some of these new guys coming in, both from high school and through the transfer portal, be able to reconstruct this defensive line that was really stellar for LSU this past year. But coming up next, I'm talking a lot of football. Let's take a little bit of a basketball breather. What did Matt McMahon just show us? What we can expect from LSU basketball moving forward? And did he really show us that? We'll get into that coming up next. But before we do that, I want to let you know about the Drive Sober campaign. So if you're hanging out with some of your friends, putting back a few drinks, I mean, hey, we're almost to New Year's. You're going to be out and celebrating with your friends. Maybe a few becomes a few too many. And as the evening comes to an end, people start to head out. You think about calling for a ride, but you're like, no, it's okay. I live nearby. I can make it home. It's no big deal. But what are the odds they'll get pulled over anyway? I mean, even so, what's the worst that could happen? Maybe your insurance goes up. Maybe you lose your license. You lose your job. You total your car. Maybe you kill someone. Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic, often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So if you think that you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe, plan ahead, get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. How about those Tigers on the hardwood? How about that LSU basketball team that we saw on Wednesday night? SEC conference play debut against a top 10 Arkansas team, a game that I looked at on the schedule and I thought, oh boy, nothing like starting conference play with one of the best teams, not just in the SEC, but one of the best teams in the country. Rude awakening, welcome to SEC play. LSU gets a win against number 9 Arkansas, 60-57 to kick off conference play. So the first half was stellar for LSU. Defensively, held Arkansas to just 19 points, lowest all season long. And of course, I know this has been a short season so far, but you take your wins where you can get them. When you can limit a really good team, a talented team, a top 10 team in the country, to 19 points, the lowest mark of all year. I mean, you're going to take your wins where you can get them. Arkansas shooting just 27% from the field in the first half. LSU led Arkansas 24-19 at the half. And in the second half, things got interesting. Arkansas came back. They were able to tie. They even got the lead at one point. It was a very back and forth game in the second half. Arkansas comes back, takes the lead. LSU claws their way back, takes the lead. And it was really kind of a back and forth game in the second half. And it got interesting because of LSU's turnovers. But I think that LSU won this game by beating Arkansas at their own game. That LSU was able to do what Arkansas truly does best. Coming into this game, Arkansas was number 8 in the country, forcing 18 turnovers per game and scoring off of that. Arkansas was averaging about 23 points per game just off of turnovers alone. And that's exactly how LSU was able to win this game. LSU committed 10 turnovers. LSU forced 10 turnovers. And the difference there was LSU's defense, because LSU held Arkansas to just 4 points on turnovers, where LSU scored 13 on Arkansas's turnovers. And I think that's the game right there. Arkansas, a team that plays really tough defense and is one of the best in the country at forcing turnovers. And LSU was able to beat them at their own game. And I think that's huge. Look at Derek Fountain, double-double on the night, 14 points, 10 rebounds. Trey Howard, 19 points off the bench. I mean, LSU looked good offensively, looked great defensively. And I can sit here and break the game down all day long, but I don't think that's the interesting part of this game. I don't think, the X's and O's and the getting into the nitty gritty of the defense versus the offense and the offense versus the defense, while that's all important and fine and good because LSU showed out, the more important thing, in my opinion, is what this means, the symbolic meaning, what this means for LSU basketball moving forward. And Matt McMahon was asked that exact question by dear friend Glenn West. What does this win against Arkansas, Matt McMahon's first SEC game against number 9 Arkansas, what does a win against Arkansas represent?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Glenn. We always just kind of go one game at a time, as boring and cliche as it is. The goal is to go 1-0, and for us, we're such a work in progress. We're just trying to get better every day in practice, every game. But obviously, the goal is to win while doing it. So I hope it's something we can continue to build on. There are a lot of things that went into winning tonight. I thought our defensive effort, our ability to defend the paint was much improved. I was really concerned coming in. Arkansas is probably the best team in America at forcing turnovers and converting those turnovers into points in transition. A lot of positives to take from it. Obviously, it wasn't an offensive masterpiece for anybody, but winning's winning. We'll take it, and really proud of our players.
There you go. Matt McMahon saying, hey, Arkansas, one of the best teams at forcing turnovers and turning those turnovers into points. And he says, I don't really know how much you can place a statement on this game and say, okay, moving forward, we're going to be so fueled by this game. And he gives us a lot of coach speak of, we want to be 1-0 day in and day out. We want to be 1-0. And I think that's fair. Beating Arkansas doesn't necessarily give LSU a bid to the tournament in March. It doesn't necessarily mean that LSU is going to be a massive powerhouse, the team to beat for the rest of the season. And we don't know what's going to happen with the rest of the season. I can't say that. You can't say that. But what I can say is that is the best way to start it. That if Matt McMahon and this LSU basketball team wants to be the kind of team that goes 1-0 week in and week out, we'll go 1-0 against Arkansas in your first SEC try. Well, that's pretty darn good, considering where this team came from. I mean, think about this team, this time a few months ago, maybe even like a year ago, less than a year ago. It was, April-ish? March, April? Will Wade gets fired. LSU loses all of their scholarship players. FBI probe. This program was in complete disarray. I mean, I fully expected LSU basketball to just be in a really tough position this season and for the next couple of years. It's not easy to rebuild a program, especially when your program has been so publicly criticized and has received so much public vitriol after what Will Wade left to LSU in his wake. But I think that this is the biggest statement of, even though this doesn't mean that LSU is winning it all, even though this doesn't mean that LSU is going to run the table in the SEC tournament and they're going to be the team to beat, what it does mean is that this team is not going to be a doormat. Is that this team, even though just a few short months ago, this roster was completely empty with every single hole to fill, here they are with Matt McMahon at the helm, when his guys brought in there, and they showed out against one of the top teams in the country, and they were able to get a win. And I think that's huge. And I think that speaks volumes about what Matt McMahon has been able to do in just a short period of time. We talk about it all the time with Brian Kelly. And BK got LSU to the SEC championship in year one. No, Matt McMahon is not there yet. I'm not going to say beating Arkansas in your first SEC game is winning the SEC championship or anything. I'm not saying that. But I think we have to also start looking at Matt McMahon like, what is he going to be able to do with its LSU roster in year one? I understand LSU's been playing very well this season in non-conference games. But this is where it matters. This is when it gets good. This is when you're playing some of the best teams in the country, the Arkansas, the Kentuckys, the Tennessees, so on and so forth. And you just proved in one game, I know it's one game, in one game, you proved that you could hang with them. From where you came from to where you are now, you can feel good about it. And we'll take it game by game. And we'll pick this team apart game by game. But right now, be excited about where this team is. moving forward. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Coming up next, we'll have a full bowl game preview. We will be joined by a Big Ten expert to get his expertise on what this Purdue game, what this Citrus Bowl game means to Purdue, kind of what Purdue's team is looking like, kind of the morale of the team. We'll get into all of that coming up next. But make your second listen today, Locked On Sports Today. Peter Bukowski brings you the biggest stories from around the sports world in around 20 minutes. Get the analysis and opinions before anyone else with your local and national experts and insiders. Local Locked On Sports Today podcast, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.